Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire un article du New York Times du 29 mars 2025. Opération de la CIA et commando en Ukraine. Pouvons-nous simplement admettre que nous menons cette guerre? Pas de troupes sur le terrain semble être une assurance creuse compte tenu de ce nouveau rapport du New York Times. Donc aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire cet article en 3 parties. Tout d'abord en anglais. La partie 1, c'est parti.
The Partnership. The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. By Adam Entus. Adam Entus conducted more than 300 interviews over more than a year with government, military and intelligence officials in Ukraine, the United States, Britain, Germany, Poland, Belgium, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and Turkey. On a spring morning 2 months after Vladimir Putin's invading armies marched into Ukraine, a convoy of unmarked cars slid up to a Kiev street corner and collected 2 middle-aged men in civilian clothes. Leaving the city, the convoy, manned by British commandos, out of uniform but heavily armed, traveled 400 miles west to the Polish border. The crossing was seamless, on diplomatic passports. Farther on, they came to the Rzeszów airport, where an idling C-130 cargo plane waited. The passengers were top Ukrainian generals. Their destination was Clay Kaserne, the headquarters of U.S. Army Europe and Africa in Wiesbaden, Germany. Their mission was to help forge what would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war in Ukraine. One of the men, Lieutenant General Mikhailo Zabrodsky, remembers being led up a flight of stairs to a walkway overlooking the cavernous main hall of the garrison's Tony Base Auditorium. Before the war, it had been a gym, used for all-hands meetings, army band performances and Cub Scout Pinewood derbies. Now General Zabrodsky peered down on officers from coalition nations, in a warren of makeshift cubicles, organizing the first Western shipments to Ukraine of M777 artillery batteries and 155mm shells. Then he was ushered into the office of Lieutenant General Christopher T. Donahue, commander of the 18th Airborne Corps, who proposed a partnership. Its evolution and inner workings visible to only a small circle of American and Allied officials, that partnership of intelligence, strategy, planning and technology would become the secret weapon in what the Biden administration framed as its effort to both rescue Ukraine and protect the threatened post-World War II order. Today that order, along with Ukraine's defense of its land, teeters on a knife edge, as President Trump seeks rapprochement with Mr. Putin and vows to bring the war to a close. For the Ukrainians, the auguries are not encouraging. In the great power contest for security and influence after the Soviet Union's collapse, a newly independent Ukraine became the nation in the middle, its westward lean increasingly feared by Moscow. Now, with negotiations beginning, the American president has baselessly blamed the Ukrainians for starting the war, pressured them to forfeit much of their mineral wealth and asked the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire without a promise of concrete American security guarantees, a peace with no certainty of continued peace. Mr. Trump has already begun to wind down elements of the partnership sealed in Wiesbaden that day in the spring of 2022. Yet to trace its history is to better understand how the Ukrainians were able to survive across 3 long years of war, in the face of a far larger, far more powerful enemy. It is also to see, through a secret keyhole, how the war came to today's precarious place. With remarkable transparency, the Pentagon has offered a public inventory of the $66.5 billion array of weaponry supplied to Ukraine, including, at last count, more than 500 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, 10,000 Javelin anti-armor weapons, 3,000 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 272 howitzers, 76 tanks, 40 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, 20 Mi-17 helicopters and 3 Patriot air defense batteries. But a New York Times investigation reveals that America was woven into the war far more intimately and broadly than previously understood. At critical moments, the partnership was the backbone of Ukrainian military operations that, by U.S. counts, have killed or wounded more than 700,000 Russian soldiers. Ukraine has put its casualty toll at 435,000. Side by side in Wiesbaden's Mission Command Center, American and Ukrainian officers planned Kiev's counteroffensives. A vast American intelligence collection effort both guided big-picture battle strategy and funneled precise targeting information down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field. One European intelligence chief recalled being taken aback to learn how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. "They are part of the kill chain now," he said. The partnership's guiding idea was that this close cooperation might allow the Ukrainians to accomplish the unlikeliest of feats, to deliver the invading Russians a crushing blow. An in-strike after successful strike in the first chapters of the war, enabled by Ukrainian bravery and dexterity but also Russian incompetence, that underdog ambition increasingly seemed within reach. An early proof of concept was a campaign against one of Russia's most feared battle groups, the 58th Combined Arms Army. In mid-2022, using American intelligence and targeting information, the Ukrainians unleashed a rocket barrage at the headquarters of the 58th in the Kherson region, killing generals and staff officers inside. Again and again, the group set up at another location. Each time, the Americans found it and the Ukrainians destroyed it. Farther south, the partners set their sights on the Crimean port of Sevastopol, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet loaded missiles destined for Ukrainian targets onto warships and submarines. At the height of Ukraine's 2022 counter-offensive, a pre-dawn swarm of maritime drones, with support from the Central Intelligence Agency, attacked the port, damaging several warships and prompting the Russians to begin pulling them back. But ultimately the partnership strained, and the arc of the war shifted, amid rivalries, resentments and diverging imperatives and agendas. The Ukrainians sometimes saw the Americans as overbearing and controlling, the prototypical patronizing Americans. The Americans sometimes couldn't understand why the Ukrainians didn't simply accept good advice. Where the Americans focused on measured, achievable objectives, they saw the Ukrainians as constantly grasping for the big win, the bright, shining prize. The Ukrainians, for their part, often saw the Americans as holding them back. The Ukrainians aimed to win the war outright. Even as they shared that hope, the Americans wanted to make sure the Ukrainians didn't lose it. As the Ukrainians won greater autonomy in the partnership, they increasingly kept their intentions secret. They were perennially angered that the Americans couldn't, or wouldn't, give them all of the weapons and other equipment they wanted. The Americans, in turn, were angered by what they saw as the Ukrainians' unreasonable demands, and by their reluctance to take politically risky steps to bolster their vastly outnumbered forces. On a tactical level, the partnership yielded triumph upon triumph. Yet at arguably the pivotal moment of the war, in mid-2023, as the Ukrainians mounted a counter-offensive to build victorious momentum after the first year's successes, the strategy devised in Wiesbaden fell victim to the fractious internal politics of Ukraine, the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, versus his military chief, and potential electoral rival, and the military chief versus his headstrong subordinate commander. When Mr. Zelensky sided with the subordinate, the Ukrainians poured vast complements of men and resources into a finally futile campaign to recapture the devastated city of Bakhmut. Within months, the entire counteroffensive ended in stillborn failure. The partnership operated in the shadow of deepest geopolitical fear that Mr. Putin might see it as breaching a red line of military engagement and make good on his often brandished nuclear threats. The story of the partnership shows how close the Americans and their allies sometimes came to that red line, how increasingly dire events forced them, some said too slowly, to advance it to more perilous ground, and how they carefully devised protocols to remain on the safe side of it. Time and again, the Biden administration authorized clandestine operations it had previously prohibited. American military advisors were dispatched to Kiev and later allowed to travel closer to the fighting. Military and CIA officers in Wiesbaden helped plan and support a campaign of Ukrainian strikes in Russian-annexed Crimea. Finally, the military and then the CIA received the green light to enable pinpoint strikes deep inside Russia itself. In some ways, Ukraine was, on a wider canvas, a rematch in a long history of US-Russia proxy wars: Vietnam in the 1960s, Afghanistan in the 1980s, Syria 3 decades later. It was also a grand experiment in war fighting, one that would not only help the Ukrainians but reward the Americans with lessons for any future war. During the wars against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, American forces conducted their own ground operations and supported those of their local partners. In Ukraine, by contrast, the US military wasn't allowed to deploy any of its own soldiers on the battlefield and would have to help remotely. Would the precision targeting honed against terrorist groups be effective in a conflict with one of the most powerful militaries in the world? Would Ukrainian artillerymen fire their howitzers without hesitation at coordinates sent by American officers in a headquarters 1,300 miles away? Would Ukrainian commanders, based on intelligence relayed by a disembodied American voice pleading, "There's nobody there, go," order infantrymen to enter a village behind enemy lines? The answers to those questions, in truth, the partnership's entire trajectory, would hinge on how well American and Ukrainian officers would trust one another. "I will never lie to you. If you lie to me, we're done," General Zabrodsky recalled General Donahue telling him at their first meeting. "I feel the exact same way," the Ukrainian replied. Part 1. In mid-April 2022, about 2 weeks before the Wiesbaden meeting, American and Ukrainian naval officers were on a routine intelligence sharing call when something unexpected popped up on their radar screens. According to a former senior US military officer, the Americans go, "Oh, that's the Moskva." The Ukrainians go, "Oh my God. Thanks a lot. Bye." The Moskva was the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainians sank it. A note on sourcing. Over more than a year of reporting, Adam Enters conducted more than 300 interviews with current and former policymakers, Pentagon officials, intelligence officials, and military officers in Ukraine, the United States, Britain, and a number of other European countries. While some agreed to speak on the record, most requested that their names not be used in order to discuss sensitive military and intelligence operations. The sinking was a signal triumph, a display of Ukrainian skill and Russian ineptitude. But the episode also reflected the disjointed state of the Ukrainian-American relationship in the first weeks of the war. For the Americans, there was anger because the Ukrainians hadn't given so much as a heads-up, surprise, that Ukraine possessed missiles capable of reaching the ship, and panic, because the Biden administration hadn't intended to enable the Ukrainians to attack such a potent symbol of Russian power. The Ukrainians, for their part, were coming from their own place of deep-rooted skepticism. Their war, as they saw it, had started in 2014, when Mr. Putin seized Crimea and fomented separatist rebellions in eastern Ukraine. President Barack Obama had condemned the seizure and imposed sanctions on Russia. But fearful that American involvement could provoke a full-scale invasion, he had authorized only strictly limited intelligence sharing and rejected calls for defensive weapons. Blankets and night vision goggles are important, but one cannot win a war with blankets, Ukraine's president at the time, Petro Poroshenko, complained. Eventually Mr. Obama somewhat relaxed those intelligence strictures, and Mr. Trump, in his first term, relaxed them further and supplied the Ukrainians with their first anti-tank javelins. Then, in the portentous days before Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, the Biden administration had closed the Kiev embassy and pulled all military personnel from the country. A small team of CIA officers was allowed to stay. As the Ukrainians saw it, a senior US military officer said, "We told them, the Russians are coming, CYA." When American generals offered assistance after the invasion, they ran into a wall of mistrust. "We're fighting the Russians." "You're not." "Why should we listen to you?" Ukraine's ground forces commander, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, told the Americans the first time they met. General Syrsky quickly came around. The Americans could provide the kind of battlefield intelligence his people never could. In those early days, this meant that General Donahue and a few aides, with little more than their phones, passed information about Russian troop movements to General Syrsky and his staff. Yet even that ad hoc arrangement touched a raw nerve of rivalry within Ukraine's military, between General Syrsky and his boss, the armed forces commander, General Valery Zaluzhny. To Zaluzhny loyalists, General Syrsky was already using the relationship to build advantage. Further complicating matters was General Zaluzhny's testy relationship with his American counterpart, General Mark A. Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In phone conversations, General Milley might second-guess the Ukrainians' equipment requests. He might dispense battlefield advice based on satellite intelligence on the screen in his Pentagon office. Next would come an awkward silence, before General Zaluzhny cut the conversation short. Sometimes he simply ignored the Americans' calls. To keep them talking, the Pentagon initiated an elaborate telephone tree. The Milley aide would call Major General David S. Baldwin, commander of the California National Guard, who would ring a wealthy Los Angeles blimp maker named Igor Pasternak, who had grown up in Lviv with Alexei Reznikov, then Ukraine's defense minister. Mr. Reznikov would track down General Zaluzhny and tell him, according to General Baldwin, "I know you're mad at Milley, but you have to call him." Ragtag alliance coalesced into partnership in the quick cascade of events. In March, their assault on Kiev stalling, the Russians reoriented their ambitions and their war plan, surging additional forces east and south, a logistical feat the Americans thought would take months. It took 2.5 weeks. Unless the coalition reoriented its own ambitions, General Donahue and the commander of U.S. Army Europe and Africa, General Christopher G. Cavalli, concluded, the hopelessly outmanned and outgunned Ukrainians would lose the war. The coalition, in other words, would have to start providing heavy offensive weapons, M777 artillery batteries and shells. The Biden administration had previously arranged emergency shipments of anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons. The M777s were something else entirely, the first big leap into supporting a major ground war. The Defense Secretary, Lloyd J. Austin III, and General Milley had put the 18th Airborne in charge of delivering weapons and advising the Ukrainians on how to use them. When President Joseph R. Biden Jr. signed on to the M777s, the Tony Base Auditorium became a full-fledged headquarters. A Polish general became General Donahue's deputy. A British general would manage the logistics hub on the former basketball court. A Canadian would oversee training. The auditorium basement became what is known as a fusion center, producing intelligence about Russian battlefield positions, movements, and intentions. There, according to intelligence officials, officers from the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency were joined by coalition intelligence officers. The 18th Airborne is known as Dragon Corps. The new operation would be Task Force Dragon. All that was needed to bring the pieces together was the reluctant Ukrainian top command. At an international conference on April 26 at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, General Milley introduced Mr. Reznikov and a Zaluzhny deputy to Generals Cavalli and Donahue. "These are your guys right here," General Milley told them, adding, "You've got to work with them. They're going to help you." Bonds of trust were being forged. Mr. Reznikov agreed to talk to General Zaluzhny. "Back in Kiev, we organized the composition of a delegation to Wiesbaden," Mr. Reznikov said. And so it began. At the heart of the partnership were two generals, the Ukrainian, Zabrodsky, and the American, Donahue. General Zabrodsky would be Wiesbaden's chief Ukrainian contact, although in an unofficial capacity, as he was serving in parliament. In every other way, he was a natural. Like many of his contemporaries in the Ukrainian military, General Zabrodsky knew the enemy well. In the 1990s, he had attended military academy in St. Petersburg and served for 5 years in the Russian army. He also knew the Americans. From 2005 to 2006, he had studied at the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. 8 years later, General Zabrodsky led a perilous mission behind lines of Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine, modeled in part on one he had studied at Fort Leavenworth, the Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart's famous reconnaissance mission around General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac. This brought him to the attention of influential people at the Pentagon. The general, they sensed, was the kind of leader they could work with. General Zabrodsky remembers that first day in Wiesbaden. "My mission was to find out, who is this General Donahue? What is his authority? How much can he do for us?" General Donahue was a star in the clandestine world of special forces. Alongside CIA kill teams and local partners, he had hunted terrorist chiefs in the shadows of Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. As leader of the elite Delta Force, he had helped build a partnership with Kurdish fighters to battle the Islamic State in Syria. General Cavalli once compared him to a comic book action hero. Now he showed General Zabrodsky and his travel companion, Major General Alexander Kirilenko, a map of the besieged east and south of their country, Russian forces dwarfing theirs. Invoking their "Glory to Ukraine" battle cry, he laid down the challenge: "You can slava Ukraini all you want with other people. I don't care how brave you are. Look at the numbers." He then walked them through a plan to win a battlefield advantage by fall, General Zabrodsky recalled. The first stage was underway, training Ukrainian artillerymen on their new M777S. Task Force Dragon would then help them use the weapons to halt the Russian advance. Then the Ukrainians would need to mount a counter-offensive. That evening, General Zabrodsky wrote to his superiors in Kiev. "You know, a lot of countries wanted to support Ukraine," he recalled. "But somebody needed to be the coordinator, to organize everything, to solve the current problems and figure out what we need in the future. I said to the commander-in-chief, we have found our partner." Soon the Ukrainians, nearly 20 in all, intelligence officers, operational planners, communications and fire control specialists, began arriving in Wiesbaden. Every morning, officers recalled, the Ukrainians and Americans gathered to survey Russian weapons systems and ground forces and determine the ripest, highest value targets. The priority lists were then handed over to the Intelligence Fusion Center, where officers analyzed streams of data to pinpoint the target's locations. Inside the U.S. European Command, this process gave rise to a fine but fraught linguistic debate. Given the delicacy of the mission, was it unduly provocative to call targets targets? Some officers thought targets was appropriate. Others called them intel tippers, because the Russians were often moving and the information would need verification on the ground. The debate was settled by Major General Timothy D. Brown, European Command's intelligence chief. The locations of Russian forces would be points of interest. Intelligence on airborne threats would be tracks of interest. If you ever get asked the question, "Did you pass a target to the Ukrainians?" you can legitimately not be lying when you say, "No, I did not," one U.S. official explained. Each point of interest would have to adhere to intelligence sharing rules crafted to blunt the risk of Russian retaliation against NATO partners. There would be no points of interest on Russian soil. If Ukrainian commanders wanted to strike within Russia, General Zabrodsky explained, they would have to use their own intelligence and domestically produced weapons. "Our message to the Russians was, this war should be fought inside Ukraine," a senior U.S. official said. The White House also prohibited sharing intelligence on the locations of strategic Russian leaders, like the Armed Forces Chief, General Valery Gerasimov. "Imagine how that would be for us if we knew that the Russians helped some other country assassinate our chairman," another senior U.S. official said. "Like, we'd go to war." Similarly, Task Force Dragon couldn't share intelligence that identified the locations of individual Russians. The way the system worked, Task Force Dragon would tell the Ukrainians where Russians were positioned. But to protect intelligence sources and methods from Russian spies, it would not say how it knew what it knew. All the Ukrainians would see on a secure cloud were chains of coordinates, divided into baskets, priority 1, priority 2, and so on. As General Zabrodsky remembers it, when the Ukrainians asked why they should trust the intelligence, General Donahue would say, "Don't worry about how we found out. Just trust that when you shoot, it will hit it, and you'll like the results, and if you don't like the results, tell us, we'll make it better." The system went live in May. The inaugural target would be a radar-equipped armored vehicle known as a Zoopark, which the Russians could use to find weapon systems like the Ukrainians' M777S. The fusion center found a Zoopark near Russian-occupied Donetsk, in Ukraine's east. The Ukrainians would set a trap. First, they would fire toward Russian lines. When the Russians turned on the Zoopark to trace the incoming fire, the fusion center would pinpoint the Zoopark's coordinates in preparation for the strike. On the appointed day, General Zabrodsky recounted, General Donahue called the battalion commander with a pep talk. "You feel good?" he asked. "I feel real good," the Ukrainian responded. General Donahue then checked the satellite imagery to make sure the target and M777 were properly positioned. Only then did the artilleryman open fire, destroying the Zoopark. Everybody went, "We can do this," a U.S. official recalled. But a critical question remained: having done this against a single, stationary target, could the partners deploy this system against multiple targets in a major kinetic battle? That would be the battle underway north of Donetsk, in Severodonetsk, where the Russians were hoping to mount a pontoon bridge river crossing and then encircle and capture the city. General Zabrodsky called it a hell of a target. The engagement that followed was widely reported as an early and important Ukrainian victory. The pontoon bridges became death traps. At least 400 Russians were killed, by Ukrainian estimates. Unspoken was that the Americans had supplied the points of interest that helped thwart the Russian assault. In these first months, the fighting was largely concentrated in Ukraine's east. But US intelligence was also tracking Russian movements in the south, especially a large troop buildup near the major city of Kherson. Soon several M777 crews were redeployed, and Task Force Dragon started feeding points of interest to strike Russian positions there. With practice, Task Force Dragon produced points of interest faster, and the Ukrainians shot at them faster. The more they demonstrated their effectiveness using M777s and similar systems, the more the coalition sent new ones, which Wiesbaden supplied with ever more points of interest. You know when we started to believe? General Zabrodsky recalled. When Donahue said, "This is a list of positions." We checked the list and we said, "These 100 positions are good, but we need the other 50. And they sent the other 50. The M777s became workhorses of the Ukrainian army. But because they generally couldn't launch their 155mm shells more than 15 miles, they were no match for the Russians' vast superiority in manpower and equipment. To give the Ukrainians compensatory advantages of precision, speed, and range, Generals Cavalli and Donahue soon proposed a far bigger leap, providing high-mobility artillery rocket systems, known as HIMARS, which use satellite-guided rockets to execute strikes up to 50 miles away. The ensuing debate reflected the Americans' evolving thinking. Pentagon officials were resistant, loath to deplete the Army's limited HIMARS stocks. But in May, General Cavalli visited Washington and made the case that ultimately won them over. Celeste Wallander, then the Assistant Defense Secretary for International Security Affairs, recalled, "Milley would always say, you've got a little Russian army fighting a big Russian army, and they're fighting the same way, and the Ukrainians will never win." General Cavalli's argument, she said, was that with HIMARS, they can fight like we can, and that's how they will start to beat the Russians. At the White House, Mr. Biden and his advisors weighed that argument against fears that pushing the Russians would only lead Mr. Putin to panic and widen the war. When the generals requested HIMARS, one official recalled, the moment felt like standing on that line, wondering, if you take a step forward, is World War III going to break out? And when the White House took that step forward, the official said, Task Force Dragon was becoming the entire back office of the war. Wiesbaden would oversee each HIMARS strike. General Donahue and his aides would review the Ukrainians' target lists and advise them on positioning their launchers and timing their strikes. The Ukrainians were supposed to only use coordinates the Americans provided. To fire a warhead, HIMARS operators needed a special electronic key card, which the Americans could deactivate anytime. HIMARS strikes that resulted in 100 or more Russian dead or wounded came almost weekly. Russian forces were left dazed and confused. Their morale plummeted, and with it their will to fight. And as the HIMARS arsenal grew from 8 to 38 and the Ukrainian strikers became more proficient, an American official said, the toll rose as much as fivefold. We became a small part, maybe not the best part, but a small part, of your system, General Zabrodsky explained, adding, most states did this over a period of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But we were forced to do it in a matter of weeks. Together the partners were honing a killing machine. At their first meeting, General Donahue had shown General Zabrodsky a color-coded map of the region, with American and NATO forces in blue, Russian forces in red and Ukrainian forces in green. Why are we green? General Zabrodsky asked. We should be blue.